Hello everyone and welcome back to Terrifying Bedtime Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a trap. Thomas had always been a skeptic, raised in a small village on the outskirts of a dense, dark forest. He had heard the stories from the elders. The warnings, the tales of creatures that prowled the woods at night, of strange whispers carried on the wind, of souls lost to the earth, bound forever in the heart of the forest. The locals told him to stay away. The woods are cursed, they said. You can't leave once you enter. But Thomas was different. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or ancient magic. He believed in science, in reason, in facts. And so, when he overheard a conversation at the annual village festival about a group of people who had mysteriously disappeared during a similar night, right near the forest's edge, he couldn't resist. He had to see for himself. The moon hung low in the sky when he crossed the threshold of the trees. A chill ran down his spine, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the feeling that the forest was waiting for him, as though it had been expecting his arrival for years. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind seemed to be more than just nature. There was something in the air, something wrong. And when he found the abandoned campfire at the heart of the woods, the one that hadn't been touched in years, the truth of the forest's power was undeniable. That was when he first saw it, the figure. At first, it was a shadow at the edge of his vision, but then it stepped forward, revealing its true form, an emaciated man with hollow eyes and skin stretched thin over bones. It smiled at him, a smile that was pure malice. "Why are you here?" the man asked, his voice raspy and cold. And then Thomas understood. The forest was more than a place. It was a trap, a cursed realm where time and space bent to the will of something ancient and powerful. He had unknowingly crossed into its domain, and the moment he stepped inside, he sealed his fate. The forest wanted him, the man he had been waiting for him. But it wasn't until the whispers started, whispers that echoed in his mind, that Thomas realized just how deep the darkness went. The creatures that dwelled in the forest, the souls trapped within its roots, weren't just rumors. They were real, and they weren't going to let him leave, not without a price. This OK introduces the key elements of the story: the mysterious, ominous forest, the protagonist's skepticism, and the immediate danger that awaits him once he enters. It sets up the psychological and supernatural aspects that will unfold in the following chapters, sparking curiosity about the figure, the forest's true nature, and Thomas's struggle to survive or escape. The small village of Eldridge had always been a place where life moved slowly, wrapped in the comforting rhythm of the seasons. Nestled between dense woods and rolling hills, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and the most exciting event was the annual harvest festival. But there was one thing that had always disturbed the peaceful atmosphere, a figure that appeared in the woods every night without fail. No one knew who he was, where he came from, or what he wanted. All that was known was that he had been seen for as long as anyone could remember. At midnight, just when the moon cast its pale glow over the forest, a tall, shadowy man would emerge from the trees. He never spoke, never moved from his spot, but his presence was unmistakable. He would stand at the forest's edge, staring into the village with unblinking eyes, and then, as if satisfied, he would disappear before the first light of dawn. For generations, the villagers had whispered about him. Some claimed he was a ghost, others thought he might be a cursed spirit, but no one dared to get too close. Over time, the man became a myth, an eerie figure woven into the fabric of the village's history. Children were told to avoid the woods at night, and adults spoke of him in hushed tones, as though mentioning his name aloud might summon him. But one night, on the eve of the harvest festival, a young man named Thomas dared to do what no one else had. He ventured into the forest to discover who the man really was. Thomas had grown up with the stories. He had listened to the older villagers talk about the man in the forest, always with a mix of fear and fascination. To him, the idea of a mysterious figure haunting the woods had always seemed like something out of a fairy tale. After all, he was a skeptic. He had always questioned the supernatural, preferring logic and reason to superstition and old wives' tales. But as the years went by, he started to grow tired of hearing the same stories over and over again. The man in the forest, he thought, had to be just a trick of the light, a figment of someone's overactive imagination. Maybe it was an old hermit, or perhaps some traveler who had taken to wandering the woods at night. Whatever it was, Thomas was determined to find out the truth. The night of the harvest festival was the perfect time to make his move. The village square was alive with music and laughter, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and sweet cider. Everyone was distracted by the celebrations, and Thomas knew he could slip away unnoticed. As midnight approached, he quietly left the festival, telling no one of his plans. He had brought only a flashlight and a knife for protection, though he didn't expect to need it. He walked quickly down the winding path that led into the forest, the sounds of the festival fading behind him. The air grew colder as he entered the woods, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The forest was eerily still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows on the forest floor. Thomas shivered, both from the cold and from the strange feeling that seemed to settle over him. The woods had never felt this ominous before. It was as though the trees themselves were watching him, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands. He pushed the thought aside. He was being foolish. There was nothing in these woods but trees and dirt. He walked deeper into the forest, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As the minutes ticked by, he began to feel the weight of his decision. What was he really doing out here? The man in the forest was just a story, right? There was nothing supernatural about it. And yet, a growing sense of unease gnawed at him. He had heard the rumors, the warnings, the way the villagers spoke of the figure with such dread. At last, he reached the clearing, the spot where the man was said to appear. Thomas stood in the middle of the open space, his breath visible in the chill air. The forest was unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath. He waited. The seconds dragged by, then the minutes. Nothing. No figure emerged from the trees. No shadowy form stepped into the moonlight. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the stories were just that, stories. Then, just as he was about to turn and head back to the village, he saw something. A shape, tall and thin, standing at the far edge of the forest. It was barely more than a shadow at first, blending with the darkness of the trees. But as Thomas's eyes adjusted to the night, he saw it more clearly. A man, a tall, gaunt figure, standing perfectly still. He was facing the village, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the man in the forest. Thomas's pulse quickened, and for the first time since he had entered the woods, he felt fear. His mind raced. What should he do? Should he approach the figure? Should he speak to him? He had no idea what to expect. For a long moment, the man didn't move. He simply stood there, like a statue, watching the village with unwavering intensity. Thomas took a cautious step forward, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots breaking the silence. The man didn't react. He didn't turn his head. Thomas, now driven by a mixture of curiosity and adrenaline, took another step forward. The light from his flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows across the clearing. He called out, his voice trembling despite himself. "Who are you?" There was no response. His fingers tightened around the handle of the flashlight. "I know what you're doing here. Why do you come to the village every night?" Still no answer. Frustration began to replace the fear. Thomas stepped closer, almost to the edge of the clearing. "Why don't you speak?" he demanded, his voice louder now. "What do you want?" It was then that the man moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. The man's face was pale, almost sickly looking, as though he hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were hollow, dark pits of emptiness, but there was something unsettlingly alive in them, a sense of awareness, a deep and unblinking gaze that seemed to pierce through Thomas. Thomas took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's lips parted slightly, as though he was about to speak. But instead of words, a low, rasping sound escaped his mouth, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest, like something ancient and forgotten. It was then that Thomas realized he had made a mistake. He shouldn't have come here. He shouldn't have challenged the man. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Thomas stumbled backward, his mind racing. What was happening? Was this a person? Or something else entirely? The moonlight seemed to grow dimmer, the shadows deeper. The trees around him seemed to sway unnaturally, their branches creaking as though in response to the man's movements. The figure took another step. Thomas was paralyzed with fear, his feet glued to the ground. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Don't come any closer," Thomas whispered, though his voice was barely audible. But the man didn't stop. He continued to advance, his form growing larger and more terrifying as he approached. Sure, here's the continuation of the story. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence that hung heavy in the air. His breath was shallow, his body frozen, as the man in the forest drew closer. The beam of his flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the clearing. But it seemed to do little to push back the growing sense of dread. The forest itself seemed to be closing in on him, the trees leaning inward as if watching in silent anticipation. The man's eyes never left him, those dark, hollow pits that seemed to draw in all the light around them. His face was pale, more than just pale, deathly, like something that hadn't seen the sun in decades. His skin hung loosely from his bones, and his clothes were ragged, torn as though he had been wandering the wilderness for ages. For a moment, Thomas wondered if he was dreaming, if he had somehow fallen asleep by the fire at the festival and this was all some twisted nightmare. But the cold air biting at his skin told him it was no dream. He was wide awake, and this figure, this thing, was real. "Why?" Thomas choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" The man did not answer, but his lips twisted upward into a grotesque semblance of a smile that sent a wave of nausea through Thomas's stomach. The figure was so close now, too close, and Thomas could feel an overwhelming urge to flee, except his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped in place, a prisoner to the intensity of the man's gaze. And then, in a voice like grinding stone, the man finally spoke. "Because you called me?" Thomas's eyes widened. "What? You?" the man rasped, the words coming out in slow, painful breaths. "You who has always questioned, always doubted. You called me here. Your mind, your skepticism, it brought me." Thomas stumbled back a step, his mind reeling. "I didn't." But the man raised a bony hand, silencing him. "You wanted to know the truth," he whispered. "You wanted to see me, and now you will." The ground beneath Thomas's feet seemed to tremble, and the air around him thickened, as though the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. His flashlight flickered out, leaving him in total darkness. And then there was a sound, a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from all around him, like the forest itself was whispering. The trees swayed violently, their branches bending in unnatural directions. It was as though the forest was alive, and it had awakened from a long, terrible slumber. A cold wind began to swirl around them, pulling at Thomas's clothes, tugging at his very soul. Suddenly, the man's face shifted, his features distorting in a way that made Thomas's stomach turn. His eyes, once dark, now glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Too bright, too wrong. His skin rippled, as though something inside of him was struggling to break free. His mouth opened wide, wider than was humanly possible, revealing a void inside, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. "No!" Thomas cried, stumbling back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What are you?" But the man knew the thing was no longer a man. It was something else entirely. Its form shifted and warped, becoming an amalgamation of darkness, tendrils of shadow stretching out in every direction. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath Thomas's feet seemed to warp and twist. The forest around him seemed to dissolve, becoming something unrecognizable. "You called me," the creature hissed, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "And now you will see the truth." In an instant, the world around Thomas shattered. The forest, the trees, the clearing, they all vanished, replaced by a vast, endless void. He was no longer in the woods. He was somewhere else, somewhere deep, somewhere wrong. The shadows in the void began to take shape, forming twisted figures that whispered his name. He could feel them pressing in on him, closing around him, and he realized with a sickening lurch that he was no longer alone. The creature that had once been the man was gone, but it had left something behind, a darkness that filled the void, something that was hungry, something that wanted to claim him. "No," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling as he took a step back. This isn't real." But the shadows only grew closer, their whispers louder, more insistent. They spoke of death, of forgotten things, of endless nights where time had no meaning. They spoke of a realm beyond the living, a place where the lost souls wandered forever. They spoke of the man in the forest, not a man at all, but a guardian, a keeper of the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. "You have crossed the threshold," one of the shadows whispered, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "And now you belong to us," Thomas screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. His body felt heavy, as though it was sinking into the darkness. The shadows closed around him, and he could feel them pulling at him, tearing him apart, drawing him into their endless depths. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness was gone. Thomas gasped for air, his chest heaving as he sat up. His hands trembled, his heart pounding in his ears. He was back in the forest, the clearing. The trees were still there, their branches rustling gently in the wind. The moon hung overhead, casting pale light on the scene, but everything felt different, wrong. He looked around frantically. The figure was gone. The shadows were gone. There was no sign of the twisted nightmare he had just experienced. But something had changed. He could feel it deep in his bones. The air was colder now, and the stillness of the forest seemed suffocating. His senses were heightened, as if the world around him was sharper, more real, but at the same time, more dangerous. He could hear the slightest rustle of leaves, the faintest whisper of the wind through the trees, and a deep, nagging feeling in the back of his mind told him that the world was not what it seemed. Thomas stood shakily to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. He had to get out of the forest. He had to go back to the village. He didn't care what the villagers had said, didn't care about the warnings. He needed to leave. But as he turned to leave the clearing, he froze. At the edge of the trees, standing just out of reach of the moonlight, was a figure. A tall, gaunt shape, cloaked in shadow. The same figure he had seen before. This time, however, there was no mistaking it. The man, or whatever it was not just watching him. It was smiling. And Thomas knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Absolutely. Here's the continuation of the story. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The figure, standing at the edge of the trees, no longer felt like a mere shadow. It had weight, substance, presence. As if it had always been there, waiting for him to notice, waiting for him to understand. The figure's eyes, dark and unblinking, burned into him, and despite the distance between them, Thomas felt as though it was pulling him, drawing him closer. His body refused to move. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn and flee, but his legs were paralyzed, as if some unseen force held him in place. The figure's smile grew wider, its lips stretching impossibly far. The dark, hollow void of its mouth seemed to expand, sucking in the night around it. Then, without warning, the figure began to speak. "You've seen the truth now, Thomas," it rasped. Its voice was a mixture of whispers and growls, as though it came from 1,000 voices all speaking at once, their words lost and fragmented. "You can never leave." Thomas's heart pounded so hard in his chest it felt like it would tear through his ribs. "No," he choked out, finally able to speak. I didn't want this." The figure stepped forward, its silhouette flickering and shifting in the moonlight. Its form was becoming more and more transparent, as though it were both part of the forest and something entirely separate. It was here, but it wasn't. It was everywhere. "You called me here, Thomas. You crossed the threshold with your own thoughts, your own disbelief. You've seen me, and now," the figure's smile twisted into something darker, more sinister. "Now you belong to the forest." Before Thomas could react, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The earth seemed to shift, the roots of the trees groaning as if alive, twisting and slithering beneath the surface. The air grew thick with an unnatural weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The trees, once still, now bent and swayed, their trunks creaking as if they were alive and breathing. The figure's laughter echoed through the clearing, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. But it was hollow in a way that scraped at the very fabric of his mind. "You can never leave this place. Not now. Not after you've seen what lies beyond. The boundary has been crossed." Thomas's pulse quickened as the realization hit him like a brick to the chest. The creature, this thing, it wasn't just guarding the forest. It was the forest. It was the very thing that held the balance between the living and the dead, between worlds. And now Thomas had become a part of it. He had broken the unspoken rule, the barrier that had kept the truth hidden from those who didn't believe. The trees around him groaned louder, and in the distance he could hear a soft whispering, an indistinct chorus of voices, far too many to count. And they weren't just whispers. They were calls, desperate, pleading voices, the lost souls of those who had crossed the threshold before him. "No!" Thomas shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to know. I didn't." "It's too late for regrets, Thomas," the figure interrupted, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. It stepped closer, the air around it crackling with an unnatural energy. "The truth cannot be unseen. The boundary is broken. And now you are mine." The ground beneath Thomas's feet began to quake. The forest seemed to be closing in on him, its vastness swallowing him whole. In the distance he saw them, the shapes, the figures, the lost souls. They were moving through the trees, their forms flickering like shadows. Eyes that glowed with a faint, otherworldly light stared at him from between the branches, and their whispers grew louder. "You called us," they murmured, their voices a chorus of regret and hunger. "And now you will join us." Thomas staggered backward, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He could feel the forest pressing in around him, the weight of it too much to bear. The figure reached out, its skeletal hand stretching toward him, its fingers long and sharp. Without thinking, Thomas turned and ran. His feet pounded against the earth, his breath ragged and desperate. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The sound of the whispers followed him, the rustling of the trees now sounding like 1,000 voices calling his name. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The trees blurred past him like a river of dark shapes, and the moon, which had once been so clear, now appeared dim, obscured by the thickening mist. His body felt heavier with each step, as though the very air was trying to drag him back. Suddenly he stumbled. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and he found himself falling forward, crashing into the dirt. His hands scraped against the rough earth, and when he looked up, the forest around him had changed. The trees, once tall and imposing, were now twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, blocking out the sky. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant whispers of the souls who had once walked this path before him. The clearing he had been running toward now seemed like a distant memory, as if it had never existed in the first place. When Thomas stood, shaking, he turned back to look at the figure, but it was gone. For a brief moment, he thought maybe he had escaped, that the nightmare was over. But then, the whispering grew louder, closer, and the trees seemed to move, their trunks bending and swaying, drawing nearer. The ground trembled again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The earth was shifting beneath him. Something was rising from the soil, pulling itself from the depths of the forest, as if the forest itself had decided to awaken. Thomas's heart thundered in his chest. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind racing to make sense of the horror unfolding before him. The whispers were no longer distant. They were in his ears, close enough to feel like they were crawling beneath his skin. A low rumble filled the air, vibrating through his bones, as the ground before him split open. Dark roots, twisted and gnarled, broke through the earth, dragging with them something. Someone, a figure. A pale face, eyes wide with terror, was visible as the figure emerged from the depths of the earth. It was a man, but not like any man Thomas had ever seen. The man's skin was stretched thin over his bones, his eyes dark and sunken, as if he had been buried alive for years. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He reached for Thomas, his fingers curling toward him, desperate. And then, from behind, more figures emerged, one by one, crawling from the dirt, from the twisted roots that rose like claws from the ground. These were the souls, the ones who had called this place home, trapped forever in the forest, never to escape. Thomas stumbled back, his legs giving way beneath him as the figures closed in on him, their eyes empty but filled with an unrelenting hunger. The whispers were deafening now, their voices blending together in a maddening chorus. "No," Thomas gasped, his voice breaking. I don't belong here." But the figures did not stop. The forest had claimed him. It had awakened, and it would not let him go. As the souls reached for him, their cold hands grasping at his clothes, his skin, pulling him into the depths of the forest, Thomas realized, with crushing clarity, that the forest had always been waiting for him, and now he would never leave. Of course. Here's the final part of the story. Thomas's body was pulled toward the figures, his legs buckling beneath him as their cold, clammy hands wrapped around his arms and waist. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled, but it was futile. The souls, once lost and hollow, now had form. They were no longer distant whispers or fleeting shadows. They were real, solid, and they were dragging him deeper into the forest. Their eyes locked on him, lifeless, but filled with an unrelenting hunger. They whispered his name in unison, their voices a mix of torment and longing. "Join us, Thomas. Join us forever." Each word felt like a blade against his soul, each whisper a slow twist of the knife. He could feel himself weakening, his mind starting to slip away as the darkness closed in. His body felt heavy, his limbs too weak to fight anymore. It was as though the very earth beneath him was pulling him down, dragging him into its cold embrace. But then, amidst the overwhelming weight of despair, something flickered, a flash of clarity, a spark of defiance. No, Thomas wasn't ready to succumb to this nightmare. Not like this. His mind, once lost in the suffocating pull of the forest, found a new sense of focus. It was the truth he had wanted. He had demanded it, and now it was his responsibility to break free. With one final surge of strength, Thomas wrenched himself from the grip of the figures. His body screamed in protest, but he didn't care. He needed to escape. He twisted, pulling his arm from one of the soul's cold, bony fingers, and staggered backward, away from the grasping hands, from the endless pull of the forest. The ground beneath him was treacherous, the roots threatening to trip him at every turn. But he didn't stop. He ran. He ran deeper into the heart of the forest, where the trees seemed to close in on him, blocking out the moonlight, suffocating the world around him. The air grew thick and heavy, but Thomas didn't falter. Ahead of him, the clearing came into view, the place where he had first encountered the figure. But now as he neared it, it was different. The air had a strange electric charge, and the shadows that had once loomed at the edges of the trees now shifted unnaturally, swirling around him like a storm. It was as if the forest itself was alive, waking up to consume him. But Thomas knew what he had to do. He couldn't fight it forever. He reached the center of the clearing and stopped, his chest heaving, his body trembling from the effort of escape. He turned, his back to the trees, and faced the empty space before him. He could still feel them, the souls. They were closing in, whispering, waiting for him to give in. But he wouldn't. Thomas raised his arms above his head, eyes closed in concentration. He had read about rituals, about ways to break curses. He had never believed in such things, but now he had no choice. The whispers in his mind grew louder, louder still. They clawed at his thoughts, trying to drown him in their maddening chorus. Think, Thomas. You must focus. And in that moment of clarity, he remembered something buried deep within him. The key to breaking the curse. He had seen it in his dreams, felt it in the air, in the heart of the forest. He drew in a deep breath, willing himself to be calm, to focus on the pulse of the earth beneath him, on the roots beneath the surface of the soil. He reached out with his mind, his spirit, calling upon the forces that governed life and death, that kept the balance between worlds. Release me, he shouted, his voice raw, echoing through the forest. I will not be yours. I choose the living. The ground trembled again, but this time the roots pulled back. The air shifted. The forest exhaled, a long, deep breath, as though it were waking from a deep slumber. And then the figure stopped. Thomas opened his eyes. They were gone. The whispers faded. The forest, once suffocating, had gone silent. The figure that had first watched him from the shadows appeared before him again. But this time, it was no longer a man. It was something different, something vast, something ancient and unknowable. It loomed above him, its eyes flickering with the knowledge of centuries. You defied me, it said, its voice reverberating in the air, as though it came from all directions at once. You cannot leave the forest unscathed. You have seen too much. Thomas stood tall, despite the weight of fear still lingering at the edges of his mind. His body ached, his spirit tired, but he knew he had one chance to escape, one chance to take back control. I have seen enough, he said, his voice steady. But you won't keep me here. You won't take me. I refuse. For a long moment, the figure didn't respond. Then, as though it had considered his words, it stepped back. You may leave, it said, its voice now strangely cold, almost resigned. But know this, you will never be free of me. I am part of you now. You will carry me with you, always. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The figure faded into the mist, dissolving back into the shadows of the forest as the trees began to calm, their twisted branches settling into place. The weight in the air lifted. The forest had released him. The curse was broken. For now. Thomas woke in his bed, drenched in sweat, his heart still racing. The sun had risen, casting warm light through his window. The sounds of birds singing drifted in through the open window, a peaceful melody that seemed so foreign after the horrors of the night. It was over. The forest, the whispers, the curse, it had all faded, left behind in the dark woods. Or so he thought. As he sat up in bed, his gaze fell on the window, and for a moment, he swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond his view. Tall, shadowed, watching. His heart stopped for a moment, but then the figure was gone. Thomas stood, his legs still weak from the ordeal, and walked toward the window. The forest outside was still calm, as if nothing had ever happened. The air felt fresh, the sun warm, And yet, as he turned away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, something just beyond the veil of reality. He had escaped, yes, but the forest had claimed him, and no matter where he went, it would always watch, always wait, waiting for the next time his curiosity would call it back. For now, Thomas was free, but he knew, deep in his soul, that he would never be able to escape the forest completely.